They thought they could get away with it. The mocking laughter, the unrelenting blasts of icy water, the cruel taunts, they wielded their power with arrogance, never expecting the tables to turn. But what happens when the ones they humiliate are not just victims, but a couple with unshakable resolve? The quiet streets that night were supposed to be a shortcut home for Emma, a moment of calm after a long day. Instead, it became the stage for an unspeakable act of abuse. A group of firefighters, trusted public servants, turned their authority into a weapon. What they didn't know? Emma's husband, Michael, was the state governor, and together, they would fight back with a force none of them anticipated. The injustice they endured ignited a movement that would echo far beyond that night, sparking conversations about power, accountability, and what it truly means to stand for justice. Before we dive deeper into this gripping tale of resilience and justice, comment below with the city or town you're watching from today. And if you're inspired by stories of courage and change like this one, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. You won't want to miss what's coming next. Emma adjusted her bag on her shoulder as she walked through the quiet streets of her neighborhood. It had been a long, draining day at work, and her only thought was to make it home to Michael, her husband, who was likely waiting for her with dinner already prepared. The sun was dipping below the city skyline, casting golden streaks across the horizon, but Emma's thoughts were elsewhere. She had walked this route many times before, a shortcut through a quieter, less populated area of town that was under some mild construction. It wasn't the most well-lit place, but it was familiar, and tonight, familiarity was a comfort. Emma quickened her pace, the distant hum of cars from the busier streets behind her. As she walked, she couldn't help but reflect on the weight of her day. Being one of the few women of color in her field often meant carrying a little extra burden, navigating microaggressions and assumptions with a poise she had honed over the years. But tonight, those thoughts were eclipsed by a deep longing for home, a safe space where Michael always greeted her with warmth and kindness. Michael wasn't just her husband, he was also the governor of the state. Though his position brought with it a certain level of public scrutiny, Michael had a way of keeping their personal life grounded. Their evenings together were sacred, a time to escape the chaos of the outside world and simply be with one another. Emma pulled her coat tighter around her as she crossed into the quieter part of town. The streets were undergoing maintenance, with some areas cordoned off by bright orange cones and caution tape. The silence here was different, heavier. It was the kind of silence that made her more attuned to the sound of her own footsteps. As she neared the corner of a dimly lit block, her gaze landed on a fire station. A group of firefighters stood near the truck bay, laughing loudly as they finished what looked like an evening drill. Normally, Emma wouldn't have paid them much attention. Firefighters were a respected part of the community, and men and women were dedicated to serving others. But tonight, something about their laughter felt different. Emma kept her head down as she walked past, not wanting to interrupt whatever camaraderie they were sharing. But out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a few of them glancing her way. At first, she thought nothing of it. Maybe they were just curious. After all, she wasn't exactly dressed like someone who belonged in a construction zone. But the glance turned into stares. Emma could feel the weight of their gazes, and unease began to settle in her chest. She quickened her steps, her heels clicking against the uneven pavement, but the sound of heavy boots behind her stopped her in her tracks. "Hey there." The voice was sharp, laced with a kind of mock friendliness that immediately put Emma on edge. She turned slowly to see one of the men, tall, broad-shouldered, and with a cocky smirk, stepping away from the group. His name tag read Jack, though she didn't know it yet. "You lost, ma'am?" Jack asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Emma forced a polite smile, though her nerves were already on high alert. "No, thank you, I'm just heading home." Jack's smirk widened as he glanced over his shoulder at the other firefighters, who were now watching with open amusement. "Heading home, huh? Well, this ain't exactly the safest place to be walking alone at night. Maybe you need a little guidance." Emma stiffened. The sarcasm in his voice was impossible to miss. "I'm fine, thank you," she replied firmly, turning to continue on her way. But before she could take another step, 2 more firefighters broke away from the group and joined Jack, effectively blocking her path. The air between them shifted, the casual banter giving way to something darker. "Relax," said one of the others, whose name tag read Tom. He had a younger face but an unsettling grin. "We're just trying to be friendly. You look like you're a little out of place around here." Emma's heart began to race. She could feel the adrenaline surging through her veins as her body prepared for fight or flight. Still, she forced herself to remain calm, to keep her voice steady. "I don't want any trouble," she said carefully. "I just want to get home." Her words only seemed to amuse them. Jack chuckled, leaning in closer. "Trouble? Who said anything about trouble? We're just having a conversation." The third man, Ryan, crossed his arms, his posture intimidating. "You should probably stick around a bit. You know, for your own safety." Emma took a small step back, her instincts screaming at her to run, but she knew better than to show fear. These men weren't just taunting her, they were asserting dominance, using their uniforms as a shield for their intimidation. She had faced challenges before, but this was different. This wasn't a microaggression at work or a dismissive comment from a stranger. This was a direct confrontation, and she was alone. "I appreciate your concern," Emma said, her voice sharper now. "But I don't need your help." Jack's smirk faded into something more menacing. "That's a shame," he said, reaching out as if to block her from stepping around him. Emma's body tensed as she instinctively moved back. Her voice rose slightly, enough to signal that she wasn't backing down. "Step aside. I don't want to have to call for help." Her words hung in the air, a challenge that seemed to shift the energy among the group. Jack's eyes narrowed, and his smirk twisted into a sneer. "Help," he echoed mockingly. "Who do you think is going to help you here?" Behind him, the others laughed, their voices cold and cruel. Jack stepped closer, his hand brushing against a heavy fire hose lying on the ground. He picked it up slowly, almost casually, his movements deliberate. The laughter grew louder as Jack lifted the hose, its weight coiling in his hands like a predator preparing to strike. Emma's breath caught in her throat as the reality of the situation began to sink in. This wasn't a joke. "Relax," Jack sneered. "It's just a little water." Before Emma could react, the hose roared to life, unleashing a powerful jet of cold water that hit her square in the chest. The freezing water struck Emma with a force that took her breath away. She staggered backward, her heels slipping on the wet pavement as she tried to shield herself with her arms. The icy stream soaked her completely, drenching her coat and causing her to shiver violently. "Stop!" Emma shouted, her voice trembling as she struggled to stay on her feet. "This isn't funny?" "Bookmark, go back." Her plea was drowned out by the roar of the water and the mocking laughter of the firefighters. Jack held the hose steady, his grin widening as he adjusted the nozzle to increase the pressure. Behind him, Tom and Ryan watched with obvious amusement, their smirks lit faintly by the glow of the fire station lights. "Not so tough now, huh?" Jack jeered, his voice carrying over the sound of the spray. Emma fought to maintain her balance, but the relentless pressure of the water forced her down. She hit the pavement hard, scraping her palms and knees on the rough concrete. The humiliation stung almost as much as the physical pain. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps as she tried to crawl away from the torrent. "Please, stop," she shouted again, her voice breaking under the strain. Jack exchanged a glance with Tom, who nodded in encouragement. "Give her another one," Tom called, laughing as if this were nothing more than a game. Jack complied without hesitation, angling the hose to deliver another punishing blast of water. This time, it struck Emma square in the back, forcing her flat against the pavement. The impact sent shockwaves through her body, and she could feel the sting of tears in her eyes, not from the water, but from the overwhelming sense of helplessness that engulfed her. As the seconds dragged on, Emma's mind raced. She had faced challenges before, systemic biases and moments of discrimination, but this was different. This was raw, unfiltered cruelty, inflicted by men who saw her not as a person but as an object of their ridicule. "Had enough yet?" Ryan sneered, leaning casually against the fire truck. Emma's jaw tightened as she forced herself onto her hands and knees. Her body ached, her clothes clung to her skin, and her dignity felt as though it had been stripped away. But somewhere deep within her, a spark of defiance began to grow. She looked up at Jack, her gaze steady despite the tears streaming down her face. "You think this makes you powerful?" she asked, her voice hoarse but unwavering. "You think this makes you men?" Her words struck a nerve. Jack's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of irritation. But it was Tom who reacted first, stepping forward with a sneer. "Oh, we're just getting started, lady," he said. "You're lucky we're in a good mood tonight." Emma clenched her fists, feeling the rough scrape of the pavement against her palms. She wanted to scream, to fight back, but she knew she was outnumbered and outmatched. Her only hope was that someone, anyone, might intervene before this situation escalated even further. Suddenly, the sound of hurried footsteps cut through the night. Emma turned her head, her heart leaping at the sight of a tall figure striding toward them. It was Michael. His presence was commanding, his expression a mixture of fury and determination. Dressed in a sharp overcoat that only amplified his air of authority, he moved with purpose, his eyes locked on the group of firefighters. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Michael demanded, his voice booming and authoritative. The laughter stopped abruptly. Jack and the others turned to face him, their smug expressions replaced with something closer to annoyance. Jack was the first to speak, lowering the hose slightly but keeping his grip firm. "Who are you supposed to be?" Jack asked, his tone dismissive. Michael didn't flinch. He stepped closer, his gaze cold and unyielding. "That's my wife," he said sharply, motioning toward Emma, who was still struggling to push herself off the ground. "And I'm telling you to back off." Ryan snorted, crossing his arms as he leaned against the truck. "Your wife?" "Huh," he said, glancing at Emma with a mocking grin. "Doesn't look like she belongs here." Michael's jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. "I'm the governor of this state," he said, his voice steady and deliberate, "and I'm giving you one last chance to walk away before this becomes a very big problem for all of you." The firefighters exchanged glances, their disbelief evident. Tom let out a bark of laughter, shaking his head. "Governor?" he repeated, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "Nice try, buddy. You really expect us to believe that?" Michael took another step forward, his shoulders squared. "I'm not asking you to believe me," he said evenly. "I'm telling you to step away now, or you'll regret it." Jack's expression darkened, his grip tightening on the hose. "Regret it?" he echoed mockingly. "You think you can just walk in here and start giving orders?" Michael didn't waver. "I'm not giving orders. I'm making a promise." For a moment, there was a tense silence as the two men stared each other down. Then, with a sneer, Jack lifted the hose once more. "Let's see how tough you really are, Governor," he said, before unleashing another powerful stream of water, this time aimed directly at Michael. The force of the blast hit Michael square in the chest, knocking him backward. Emma cried out, reaching for him instinctively, but the relentless spray forced her back as well. The firefighters erupted into laughter again, their taunts growing louder as they watched the governor struggle against the torrent. "Not so high and mighty now, are you?" Ryan called, his voice dripping with contempt. Michael gritted his teeth, his hands bracing against the wet pavement as he tried to push himself upright. The water was freezing, the pressure almost unbearable, but he refused to let them see him break. Emma crawled toward him, her movements slow and deliberate as she fought against the onslaught. She reached for his arm, her fingers closing around his wrist as she helped him steady himself. "This isn't over," Michael said, his voice low but filled with an unshakable resolve. Jack laughed, lowering the hose just enough to smirk at him. "Oh, it's over," he said, "for you." Emma and Michael remained on the ground, drenched and shivering, but neither showed any signs of giving up. The firefighters stood over them, smug and triumphant, as if their actions were justified simply because they wore the uniforms of public servants. Emma's hair clung to her face, her clothes soaked and heavy against her skin. She could feel the rough pavement beneath her hands, cold and unyielding. Her body trembled, not just from the freezing water, but from the sheer frustration and anger boiling inside her. Michael shifted beside her, trying to sit up despite the water dripping from his coat and pooling around him. His jaw was set, his expression resolute even as the cold bit into his skin. The ringleader Jack stepped closer, letting the hose dangle at his side, His eyes gleamed with malice, and the smirk on his face was one of twisted satisfaction. "What's the matter, Governor?" Jack sneered, his voice thick with mockery. "You're looking a little defeated." Michael met Jack's gaze, his own expression steady and unyielding. "This won't end the way you think it will," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You're making a mistake that's going to follow you for the rest of your life." Jack's smirk faltered for just a moment before he laughed, a hollow sound that was quickly echoed by his companions. Tom clapped Jack on the shoulder, grinning as he leaned down toward Michael. "Mistake?" Tom echoed, his tone dripping with sarcasm. "The only mistake here is you thinking anyone's going to care about what happens to the two of you." Emma clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she forced herself to sit upright. She felt the weight of their disdain, the way their words and actions sought to strip her of her dignity. But she refused to let them see her broken. "You think this makes you powerful?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly but growing stronger with each word. "Humiliating us like this? Using your uniforms to justify your cruelty? It doesn't make you strong. It makes you cowards." The laughter stopped. For a moment, the group of firefighters seemed taken aback, as if they hadn't expected Emma to speak. Jack's smirk twisted into a scowl, and he took a step toward her, his boots splashing in the puddle of water around her. "Cowards?" he repeated, his tone low and dangerous. "You've got a lot of nerve talking to us like that, lady." Emma didn't flinch. "And you've got a lot of nerve calling yourselves firefighters." She shot back. "You're supposed to protect people, not attack them." Jack's eyes narrowed, and his hand tightened around the hose. "You don't know a damn thing about us," he said, his voice a sharp hiss. Tom stepped forward, shaking his head as if trying to diffuse the tension, but his grin betrayed his true intentions. "Relax, Jack," he said, his tone casual. "She's just upset. Can't handle a little water, I guess." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but Michael placed a hand on her arm, a silent gesture urging her to stay calm. He could see the anger simmering in her eyes, the way her body tensed with the desire to fight back. But he also knew that provoking them further could make things even worse. Michael turned his attention back to Jack, his expression hardening. "You've crossed a line," he said, his voice steady despite the chill in his bones. "And I promise you there will be consequences for this. You're not untouchable." Jack let out a derisive laugh, shaking his head. "You think you can just throw around your title and scare us?" he asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "Nobody cares that you're the governor." Ryan, who had been mostly quiet until now, chimed in with a sneer. "Yeah, and no one's going to believe you anyway. You'll just be another loudmouth trying to stir up trouble." The words stung, but Michael didn't let them see his frustration. Instead, he stood slowly, his movements deliberate as he straightened his coat. Despite the water soaking through every layer of his clothing, he carried himself with the dignity of his office. Emma followed his lead, rising to her feet even as her body protested. Her clothes clung to her skin, and her knees ached from where she'd fallen earlier, but she refused to show any sign of weakness. The couple stood side by side, their posture a silent testament to their resilience. Jack and his companions seemed momentarily unsure of what to do, their bravado wavering in the face of the couple's quiet strength. "This isn't over," Michael said, his tone calm but resolute. "You can laugh all you want now, but when the consequences come, you'll wish you had walked away." Jack's scowl deepened, but he didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Tom and Ryan, muttering something under his breath. The other two shrugged, their smirks fading as they exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Jack let out a frustrated growl and tossed the hose onto the ground. "Let's go," he said sharply, motioning for the others to follow. As the group retreated back toward the fire station, Emma and Michael watched them go, their hearts pounding with a mix of anger and relief. The firefighters disappeared into the shadows, their laughter fading into the distance. Emma let out a shaky breath, her body trembling from the cold and the adrenaline coursing through her veins. Michael placed a reassuring hand on her back, his touch steady and grounding. "We're not letting them get away with this," Emma said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. Michael nodded. "We'll make sure they face justice," he said, his tone equally determined. "They don't know who they're dealing with." Just then, a voice called out from across the street, "Hey, are you two okay?" They turned to see a young man approaching cautiously, his phone in hand. His expression was a mixture of concern and anger, and as he drew closer, Emma realized he had been recording the entire incident. "I saw what they did," the man said, holding up his phone. "I've got it all on video." For the first time that night, Emma felt a flicker of hope. The evidence was in their hands, and with it, the truth of what had happened could no longer be ignored. The young man approached cautiously, his phone still held up as if he was ready to capture more. He couldn't have been more than 25, with a slim frame and a nervous but determined energy about him. His hands trembled slightly as he held out the phone toward Emma and Michael, the screen still recording. "I saw the whole thing," he said, his voice shaky but firm. "What they did, it's wrong. I couldn't just stand by." Emma exchanged a glance with Michael, her heart still racing from the ordeal. The raw humiliation of what had just happened lingered heavily in her chest, but the young man's words brought a glimmer of relief. Someone had been there. Someone had witnessed the cruelty and cared enough to act. "Thank you," Michael said, his voice calm but edged with exhaustion. He stepped forward, his presence still commanding despite the water dripping from his soaked coat. "You have no idea how much this means to us." The young man nodded, his grip on the phone tightening as if he were afraid to let go of the evidence. "I've already called the police," he said. "They should be on their way. Those guys, they need to pay for what they've done." Emma felt a surge of gratitude for the stranger, a person who could have easily ignored the situation but had chosen to step in. She reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "What's your name?" she asked softly. "David," he replied, glancing nervously over his shoulder, as though expecting the firefighters to return. I didn't know what else to do, but I couldn't just watch and not do something." "You did the right thing," Michael assured him, his tone steady. "This video could make all the difference." For a moment, the three of them stood in a tense silence, the sound of distant traffic the only thing breaking through the stillness of the night. Emma shivered, wrapping her arms around herself as the cold began to seep deeper into her bones. Michael immediately noticed and placed a protective arm around her shoulders. The faint wail of sirens in the distance brought both relief and trepidation. Help was on the way, but so were questions, scrutiny, and the possibility of facing their attackers again. Emma closed her eyes briefly, drawing strength from Michael's presence beside her. When the police arrived, their flashing lights cast an eerie glow over the wet pavement and the still dripping fire station in the distance. 2 squad cars pulled up, and several officers stepped out, their expressions a mixture of professionalism and curiosity as they approached the group. "Evening," said the senior officer, a stocky man with a clipped tone and a badge that read Lieutenant Harris. His eyes scanned Emma and Michael, taking in their soaked clothes, disheveled appearances, and the tension etched into their faces. "We got a report about an incident here. Can someone tell me what's going on?" David stepped forward immediately, holding up his phone. "I recorded it," he said, his voice more confident now. "A group of firefighters, those guys from the station over there, they attacked them. They used a hose on them. It was horrible." Lieutenant Harris's brow furrowed as he turned his attention fully to Emma and Michael. "Is this true?" he asked, his tone softening slightly. "Yes," Michael said, his voice steady despite the visible strain on his face. "We were walking home. They harassed my wife, and when I intervened, they turned the hose on both of us. It wasn't an accident, it was deliberate." Harris's expression hardened as he glanced at the fire station in the distance. He turned back to David, gesturing toward the phone. "You said you recorded this?" David nodded quickly. "Yes, I've got it all here. Everything they did." "Let me see it," Harris said. David handed over the phone and Harris watched the video in silence, his jaw tightening as the footage unfolded. The sounds of laughter and jeering, the forceful blasts of water, and the pleas for them to stop were unmistakable. When the video ended, Harris let out a slow breath, his face grim. "This is serious," he said, glancing back at the group of officers standing by the cars. "We'll need to take your statements and secure this evidence. Those men are going to have to answer for this." Emma felt a mix of emotions, relief that they were finally being taken seriously. but also a lingering sense of unease. "Are you going to arrest them?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Harris hesitated for a moment before nodding. "If the video matches your statements, yes. This is assault, plain and simple. They don't get to hide behind their uniforms." The weight of his words settled over the group. For the first time that night, Emma felt a small sense of vindication. But she knew this was only the beginning. As the officers began taking statements, Harris spoke quietly with one of his subordinates, who nodded and headed toward the fire station. Emma watched as the officer disappeared into the building, her heart pounding at the thought of confronting her attackers again. Michael placed a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. "This is the right thing to do," he said softly. "I know," Emma replied, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at the edges of her resolve. "But it's not just about us. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." David stayed close by, his presence a silent reassurance. When the officer returned, he had a stern expression. "The firefighters are still inside," he reported to Harris. "But they're refusing to come out. They claim they did nothing wrong." Harris's jaw tightened. "Then we'll bring them out," he said firmly, motioning for two other officers to join him. As the police moved toward the fire station, Emma and Michael stood side by side, watching as the wheels of justice began to turn. They knew it wouldn't be easy, and they knew there was still a long road ahead. But in that moment, they clung to the hope that the truth would prevail. David turned to them, his expression earnest. "You're not alone in this," he said. "There are people who care, who'll stand with you." Emma managed a small smile, her gratitude shining through despite her exhaustion. "Thank you," she said. The sound of raised voices echoed from the fire station as the officers entered, and Emma felt Michael's hand tighten around hers. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The tension in the air was palpable as Emma and Michael stood under the harsh glare of the flashing police lights. From the direction of the fire station, raised voices could be heard as the officers tried to coax the firefighters out to face the consequences of their actions. Emma's hands trembled at her sides, a mix of exhaustion and lingering fear coursing through her. She glanced at Michael, who stood tall despite the water still dripping from his soaked clothes. His jaw was set, and his eyes were fixed on the station doors as if willing them to open. "Will they even come out?" Emma asked quietly, her voice barely audible over the distant hum of city traffic. Michael's hand found hers, his grip firm and steady. "They'll have to," he said, his voice low but resolute. "The truth is out now. They can't hide from this." David stood nearby, his phone still clutched tightly in his hand. He looked between Emma and Michael, then at the fire station, where the officers were still attempting to reason with the men inside. "They were laughing," David said suddenly, his tone edged with anger. "When they sprayed you, when they knocked you down, they were laughing like it was all a game." Emma nodded, her throat tightening at the memory. "They think their uniforms make them untouchable," she said bitterly. "But they're wrong." Suddenly, the fire station doors opened, and Jack emerged, flanked by Tom and Ryan. Behind them, a few more firefighters stood hesitantly, their faces a mixture of defiance and unease. Jack's smirk had returned, though it seemed forced now, his confidence slipping under the weight of the situation. "Well, here we are," Jack called, his tone dripping with sarcasm as he spread his arms wide. "What's all the fuss about?" Lieutenant Harris stepped forward, his posture authoritative as he gestured for Jack to stay where he was. "Enough games," Harris said sharply. "We've reviewed the video, and there's no denying what happened here. You and your men assaulted two civilians. You're under investigation." Jack's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered, glancing back at Tom and Ryan for support. "Investigation?" he repeated mockingly. "Come on, Lieutenant, it's just water. No harm done." Emma's chest tightened at the flippancy of his words, but Michael's voice cut through the night with unshakable authority. "No harm done?" Michael said, stepping forward despite Harris's cautionary glance. "You used that hose like a weapon. You knocked us to the ground, humiliated us, and laughed while we begged you to stop. Do you really think anyone's going to believe this was harmless?" Jack's gaze shifted, and for a moment something like doubt flickered across his face. But Tom stepped in, his voice loud and confrontational. "Look," Tom said, crossing his arms. "We didn't do anything wrong." He he gestured toward Emma, was walking around like she owned the place. And then this guy shows up, acting like he's in charge. We were just putting them in their place. Michael's fists clenched at his sides, but he kept his tone measured. You don't get to decide someone's place, he said coldly, and you certainly don't get to use your position to intimidate and attack people. Ryan scoffed, stepping forward with a sneer. Oh, give me a break. You're just mad because we didn't bow down to your little title. Governor, huh? Funny how that doesn't mean much when you're on your knees in the dirt. The cruelty in his words cut deep. But Michael didn't flinch. Instead, he looked directly at Harris, his voice steady. You have everything you need, he said. The video, the witnesses, and now their own words. What are you waiting for? Harris nodded grimly, turning back to the firefighters. Jack, Tom, Ryan, you're all coming with us for questioning, and if the investigation confirms what we've seen, you'll be facing charges of assault and abuse of authority. The men froze, their bravado cracking under the weight of Harris's words. Jack took a step back, his smirk replaced by a scowl. This is ridiculous, he snapped. You're really going to take their word over ours? No, Harris said flatly. I'm taking the word of the video. And it doesn't lie. The officers moved in, placing the firefighters under temporary detention. Jack struggled as the cuffs clicked around his wrists, his protests growing louder with each passing second. This is a mistake, he shouted, his voice filled with indignation. You'll regret this. Michael stepped forward, his eyes locking onto Jack's. The only mistake here is yours, he said, and the only regret you'll feel is realizing too late that you're not above the law. Emma felt a surge of pride at Michael's words, his unwavering strength in the face of such blatant cruelty. She glanced at David, who gave her a small encouraging nod. As the firefighters were escorted to the squad cars, a small crowd began to gather. Neighbors who had heard the commotion peered out from their windows or stepped onto the sidewalk, their faces filled with curiosity and concern. What happened? Someone whispered. Firefighters, another replied, shaking their head. Can you believe it? Emma felt the weight of their stares but refused to let herself shrink under the scrutiny. Instead, she straightened her back and took Michael's hand, their unity a silent but powerful statement. David stepped closer, his phone still recording. This isn't just about you two, he said quietly. This is about everyone who's ever been treated like this and couldn't fight back. Emma met his gaze, her eyes filled with determination. Then, we'll make sure this fight counts, she said. Harris approached them again, his expression grim but respectful. We'll need you to come down to the station to give formal statements, he said. And we'll need a copy of that video for evidence. David nodded. You'll have it, he said firmly. Emma looked at Harris, her voice steady despite the tremor in her body. Thank you, she said, for taking this seriously. Harris nodded. It's my job, he replied. And I promise, we'll get to the bottom of this. As the squad cars pulled away, taking the firefighters into custody, Emma felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but for the first time that night, she felt like justice might actually be within reach. Michael squeezed her hand gently, his eyes filled with quiet resolve. This is just the beginning, he said. Emma nodded. Then let's make sure it ends the right way. The ride to the police station was quiet, the hum of the engine and the occasional crackle of the police radio filling the silence. Emma sat close to Michael, her hand resting in his, as she stared out the window at the passing city lights. The adrenaline that had kept her going was beginning to wane, replaced by an ache in her body and a heaviness in her chest. Michael's gaze was fixed forward, his jaw set in a way that Emma knew meant he was already strategizing. He wasn't just thinking about the statements they'd need to give or the legal hurdles they'd have to navigate. He was thinking about the bigger picture, the systemic flaws that allowed men like those firefighters to feel invincible. David followed in his own car, determined to stay by their side. The police had allowed him to keep his phone temporarily, promising to transfer the video footage once they arrived at the station. His presence was a quiet reassurance, a reminder that there were still people willing to stand up for what was right. As they pulled into the station's parking lot, Emma felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. This was the next step in a journey she hadn't asked for, but now felt compelled to see through. Inside the station, The atmosphere was both sterile and tense. Officers moved purposefully through the brightly lit space, some glancing curiously at Emma and Michael as they were led to a private interview room. The events of the night had clearly reached the ears of many, and the governor's presence only added to the weight of the situation. Lieutenant Harris joined them shortly after, carrying a clipboard and wearing an expression of grim determination. He motioned for Emma and Michael to take seats across from him at the small, unadorned table. "We'll start with your statements," Harris said, his tone professional but not unkind. "I understand this has been a difficult night, but it's important that we document everything while it's fresh." Emma nodded, drawing a deep breath to steady herself. "I just want the truth to be heard," she said quietly. "You'll have that chance," Harris assured her. "Let's begin." For the next hour, Emma recounted everything. The unease she'd felt when she first passed the fire station, the way the men had surrounded her, the crude remarks and mocking laughter, and finally, the attack itself. Her voice wavered at times, but she pressed on, determined to make every detail clear. Harris listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes, but never interrupting her. When she finished, she felt drained, as if speaking the words aloud had brought the memories crashing down on her all over again. Michael was next, his tone firm and measured as he described his arrival at the scene and his confrontation with the firefighters. He spoke of their refusal to back down, their sneers and the forceful blasts of water that had knocked him to the ground. "They didn't see us as people," Michael said, his voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath it. "To them, we were objects of ridicule, a way to amuse themselves, and they thought their uniforms made them untouchable." Harris nodded, his expression darkening. "They miscalculated," he said. "We take incidents like this very seriously, especially when it involves an abuse of authority." As Michael finished his statement, David entered the room, accompanied by another officer holding a laptop. The video had been uploaded and was ready to be reviewed. "Do you want to see it?" Harris asked, glancing at Emma and Michael. Emma hesitated, unsure if she could relive those moments so soon, but Michael nodded. "Yes," he said firmly. "It's important." The officer placed the laptop on the table and hit play. The room fell silent as the video began, the grainy footage capturing every detail, the mocking voices, the bursts of water, and the cries for mercy. Emma clenched her hands tightly in her lap, her nails digging into her palms as she watched herself being knocked to the ground. She felt a wave of shame and anger wash over her, but she forced herself to keep watching. This was the truth, undeniable and unfiltered, and it needed to be seen. When the video ended, Harris let out a slow breath, his expression somber. "This is damning evidence," he said. "It's clear that their actions were deliberate and malicious. With this and your statements, we have a strong case." David, who had been standing quietly by the door, spoke up. "What happens next?" "We'll process the evidence and formally charge the firefighters involved," Harris explained. "They're currently being held in custody, and they'll be questioned as part of the investigation. If convicted, they'll face serious consequences." Michael leaned forward, his gaze intent. "And what about the department?" he asked. "What steps are being taken to ensure this doesn't happen again?" Harris hesitated, clearly aware of the broader implications. "That's a conversation we'll need to have with the department's leadership," he admitted. "But I agree that systemic changes are necessary." Michael nodded, his expression unreadable. "Then let's start that conversation." By the time Emma and Michael left the station, the first hints of dawn were creeping over the horizon. The night had been long and grueling, but they felt a renewed sense of purpose. Outside, David was waiting for them. He had refused to leave, insisting on seeing things through to the end. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice laced with concern as they approached. Emma managed a small smile, though her exhaustion was evident. "We will be," she said. "Thanks to you." David shrugged, looking down at his feet. "I just did what anyone should do," he said. "Not everyone would," Michael replied, his tone sincere. "But you did, and that means everything." As they prepared to head home, Emma felt a mix of emotions. Relief that justice was finally in motion, but also a lingering sadness for what they had endured. Still, she knew this was only the beginning. "This fight isn't just ours," she said, glancing at Michael. "It's for everyone who's ever been treated like this and couldn't fight back." Michael nodded, his expression resolute. "And we won't stop until real change happens." By the time they arrived home, the first light of morning had turned the sky a pale blue, streaked with the faint orange glow of dawn. Emma and Michael walked in silence, their steps heavy as they crossed the threshold into the familiar warmth of their house. The comfort of home, a place that had always been their sanctuary, now felt different, its safety somehow bruised by the events. Emma moved to the kitchen, her fingers trailing over the counter, as if grounding herself in the tangible. She turned on the faucet, watching the water flow for a moment before cupping her hands under it and splashing her face. The chill reminded her of the fire hose, the sheer force of it knocking her off her feet. She gripped the edge of the sink, steadying herself. Michael appeared behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. His touch was grounding, his presence a reminder that she wasn't alone. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Words felt insufficient to capture the weight of what they'd been through. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "It wasn't just about humiliating us," she said, her voice low but firm. "It was about power, about making sure we knew they had it, and we didn't." Michael nodded, his expression thoughtful as he leaned against the counter beside her. "And they're not the only ones," he said quietly. "This kind of abuse, it's systemic. It's not just a few bad actors. It's a culture that protects them, that lets them believe they're untouchable." Emma met his gaze, her eyes searching his for something. Hope, direction, maybe both. "So how do we change it?" she asked. Michael's jaw tightened as he considered her question. "We start by making them accountable," he said. "Not just those men, but the system that allowed them to act without fear of consequences. And we make sure the world knows what happened." Emma nodded slowly, a fire igniting in her chest. They couldn't undo what had been done to them, but they could ensure it wasn't ignored. Later that day, the ripple effects of the incident began to unfold. David's video had already made its way online, shared by a growing number of people who were outraged by what they saw. The clip, just under 2 minutes long, captured the most harrowing moments. Emma being knocked to the ground, Michael standing his ground against the unrelenting stream of water, and the mocking laughter of the firefighters echoing in the background. Social media exploded with reactions, the video sparking heated discussions and widespread condemnation. Hashtags calling for justice began trending, and the story quickly gained traction in local news outlets. "Governor and wife assaulted by firefighters" blared across headlines, the stark contrast between the victims and their attackers amplifying the public's outrage. Emma sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone as messages poured in from friends, colleagues, and strangers. Some offered words of support, while others shared their own stories of facing discrimination or abuse. One message, in particular, caught her eye. A woman named Carla had written a heartfelt note describing her own encounter with a group of public officials who had used their power to intimidate her. "When I saw your video," Carla wrote, "I cried. Because it could have been me. Thank you for standing up. Thank you for showing that people like me don't have to be silent." Emma set the phone down, her chest tightening as she absorbed the weight of Carla's words. She looked across the table at Michael, who was typing furiously on his laptop, drafting a statement for the press. "They're listening," she said softly. Michael glanced up, his brow furrowed. "Who?" "The people," Emma said, her voice growing stronger. "They're listening to us. They care about what happened." Michael nodded, his expression softening. "That's why we can't stop now," he said. "This isn't just about us anymore. It's about everyone who's ever felt powerless in the face of abuse." The next morning, the press conference was held on the steps of the governor's office. Emma stood beside Michael, her hand in his, as a sea of reporters and cameras gathered before them. She could feel the weight of their stares, the energy of their anticipation, but she focused on Michael's voice as he began to speak. "What happened to my wife and me was not just an act of cruelty," Michael said, his voice steady and commanding. "It was an abuse of power, and it is a stark reminder of the work we still have to do to ensure that those who serve the public are held to the highest standards of accountability and integrity." Emma watched as the crowd hung on his every word. Michael spoke with the authority of his position, but also with the raw vulnerability of someone who had lived through the injustice he was condemning. "This isn't just about the actions of a few individuals," Michael continued. "It's about the culture that allowed those actions to happen, the systems that failed to protect the very people they are meant to serve. We cannot allow this to go unchecked." The cameras clicked furiously as Michael paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "We are calling for an immediate and thorough investigation into the fire department and its leadership," he said, "and we are demanding reforms that ensure this kind of abuse can never happen again." The crowd erupted into applause, the sound echoing off the buildings around them. Emma felt a swell of pride as she looked at Michael, his resolve shining through every word. When it was her turn to speak, Emma stepped forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before addressing the crowd. "What happened to us wasn't just about me or my husband," she began. "It was about power, who has it, who abuses it, and who is left to suffer because of it. But we won't be silent. We won't let this go unanswered." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the words pouring out of her like a dam breaking. "To anyone who has ever felt powerless, to anyone who has ever been silenced or ignored, I want you to know that your voice matters, your story matters, and we will fight for you." The applause that followed was deafening. Emma stepped back, her heart pounding as Michael took her hand once more. Together they faced the crowd, the united front against the forces that had tried to break them. As the press conference concluded, Emma felt a sense of clarity she hadn't had before. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they were no longer alone. The world was watching, and change was on the horizon. The aftermath of the press conference was immediate and overwhelming. Within hours, clips of Emma and Michael's speeches were circulating online, sparking conversations far beyond their local community. News anchors analyzed every word, civil rights leaders applauded their courage, and people from all walks of life took to social media to express their outrage over what had happened. Emma sat in the living room, scrolling through her phone, unable to look away from the tidal wave of responses. Messages of support poured in from strangers who saw themselves in her story, from activists demanding reform, and from old friends who hadn't spoken to her in years but now felt compelled to reach out. "Emma," Michael called from his office, his voice carrying a mixture of urgency and excitement. She got up and walked down the hallway, finding him at his desk with the television on. A local news station was running a live segment about the incident, but what caught her attention was the headline scrolling across the bottom of the screen: "Firefighters suspended pending investigation following governor's call for justice." Emma's breath caught in her throat. "They're actually doing it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Michael nodded, his expression a blend of satisfaction and caution. "The pressure is mounting," he said. "They can't ignore this, not with the video, not with the public outcry. But this is just the start." Emma sat beside him, her fingers gripping the armrest of his chair. She watched as the segment continued, detailing how the firefighters involved had been placed on administrative leave while the city conducted a formal investigation. The fire chief had issued a carefully worded statement, expressing regret over the incident, but stopping short of taking full accountability. "It's not enough," Emma said, her voice tightening. "No, it's not," Michael agreed, "but it's a step. And now we make sure they follow through." The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Emma and Michael met with their legal team, who assured them that the evidence was strong enough to pursue criminal charges against the firefighters. Meanwhile, city officials reached out, eager to discuss reforms that would address the deeper issues within the fire department and other public service institutions. Michael's office became a hub of activity, with staff fielding calls from reporters, community leaders, and advocacy groups. Emma, though not officially part of his administration, found herself at the center of it all, her voice becoming a powerful force in the conversation. She attended meetings with Michael, sharing her perspective and pushing for policies that would create real, lasting change. The discussions were often intense, with some officials resistant to the idea of overhauling long-standing systems. But Emma refused to back down. "This isn't just about preventing another incident like ours," she said during one particularly heated meeting. "It's about creating a culture of accountability, where people in positions of power know that they'll be held responsible for their actions. That's the only way we move forward." Her words resonated not just with the officials in the room, but with the broader public. News outlets began referring to her as more than just the governor's wife. They called her a leader, an advocate, a voice for justice. As the investigation progressed, Emma and Michael attended hearings where the firefighters were formally charged with assault and abuse of authority. The video evidence was presented, leaving little room for the defense to argue otherwise. Watching the footage in a courtroom setting was difficult for Emma, the memories still fresh and raw, but she held her head high, refusing to let the pain define her. One by one, the firefighters were questioned, their bravado from that night replaced by a stammering defensiveness. Jack, who had led the assault, attempted to downplay his actions, claiming it had all been a joke that got out of hand. Emma's jaw clenched as she listened. A joke? How could anyone justify such cruelty as humor? When it was her turn to speak, she stood before the court with a calmness that belied the storm inside her. "That night was not a joke," she said firmly. "It was an assault. It was an abuse of power. And it was a deliberate attempt to humiliate and intimidate us simply because they thought they could." Her words hung in the air, the weight of them silencing the room. She looked directly at Jack as she continued. "You used your position to harm others, and you laughed while doing it. But actions have consequences, and today you will face yours." Michael's testimony echoed her sentiments, his voice steady and resolute as he called for accountability, not just for their own sake, but for the sake of everyone who had ever been subjected to similar abuses. The court's decision was swift. The firefighters were convicted, their sentences reflecting the severity of their actions. Jack and his accomplices faced not only jail time but also permanent dismissal from their positions, their careers in public service effectively over. For Emma and Michael, the verdict was a victory, but it wasn't the end. The fight for justice had only just begun. As the weeks passed, the reforms they had called for began to take shape. The fire department implemented mandatory sensitivity training, stricter oversight policies, and a zero-tolerance approach to misconduct. These changes, while promising, were only the first step in a broader effort to address systemic issues across the city. Emma and Michael worked tirelessly, partnering with community organizations to ensure that the momentum didn't fade. They attended town hall meetings, listened to stories from residents who had faced similar injustices, and collaborated with civil rights groups to push for statewide reforms. At one such meeting, a young woman stood up to speak, her voice trembling but determined. "What happened to you?" "It could have been any of us," she said, her gaze meeting Emma's. "Thank you for not staying silent. Thank you for fighting for all of us." Emma felt a lump rise in her throat. She nodded, her voice steady as she replied, "This isn't just my fight. It's ours, and together we can make a difference." By the time the first major reforms were enacted, the city felt different. There was a sense of accountability in the air, a recognition that those in power were no longer untouchable. People who had once felt silence began to speak out, emboldened by Emma and Michael's story. One evening, as Emma and Michael walked through their neighborhood, they passed a park where a group of people had gathered. They were discussing the new policies, their voices filled with hope and determination. Emma paused, listening to their words. She felt Michael's hand slip into hers, his grip warm and steady. "We've started something," she said quietly. Michael nodded, his gaze soft as he looked at her. "And we're going to see it through," he said. As they continued walking, Emma felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in weeks. The journey had been painful, the fight exhausting, but they had turned their suffering into something meaningful. They had taken a stand, and the world was listening. Months passed, and the firestorm ignited by the events of that fateful night continued to burn brightly. What had begun as a harrowing personal ordeal for Emma and Michael had evolved into a movement for change, one that reached far beyond their city's borders. Their story became a symbol, a rallying cry for those who had long endured abuses of power in silence. Emma found herself stepping into a new role, one she hadn't anticipated, but embraced wholeheartedly. She wasn't just Michael's private partner. She had become his partner in advocacy. Together, they worked to dismantle the systems that had allowed such blatant cruelty to flourish unchecked. It wasn't always easy. For every step forward, there were obstacles: resistance from those who benefited from the status quo, skepticism from those who doubted real change was possible, and the emotional toll of revisiting their trauma time and again in the public eye. But Emma refused to waver. One day she stood before a crowd of hundreds at a community forum, her voice steady as she addressed the audience. "When that fire hose knocked me down, I felt powerless," she said, her words measured but brimming with emotion. "But what I've learned since then is that power isn't about how much you can take from someone else. True power is in lifting people up. It's in standing together and saying, 'We won't tolerate this anymore.'" The crowd erupted into applause, the energy in the room palpable. Emma glanced at Michael, who stood nearby, his expression one of quiet pride. This was why they were doing it, for the people who had been overlooked, dismissed, and hurt by the very systems meant to protect them. The reforms they fought for began to take root in tangible ways. Within the fire department, new leadership was installed and leaders committed to rebuilding trust and fostering a culture of respect and accountability. Policies were implemented to ensure that abuse of power would be met with swift consequences, and regular training sessions on equity and sensitivity became mandatory for all public service employees. But the impact didn't stop there. Inspired by their story, other cities and states began examining their own institutions, uncovering similar patterns of misconduct, and implementing their own reforms. Emma and Michael traveled across the country, sharing their experiences and collaborating with leaders who were eager to make a difference. At one such event, a young firefighter approached Emma, his expression earnest. "I want you to know," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "that your story changed the way I think about my job. It reminded me why I joined in the first place, to help people, not to hurt them. Thank you for holding us accountable." Emma smiled, touched by his sincerity. "It's never too late to do the right thing," she said gently. "And it starts with people like you." Back home, the changes were evident in smaller, quieter ways. People began to feel safer walking the streets, knowing there were mechanisms in place to protect them. Community members felt emboldened to speak out when they saw injustice, confident that their voices would be heard. One evening, as Emma and Michael walked through the city, they passed by the fire station where the attack had taken place. The building had been transformed, not just physically, with new signage and a fresh coat of paint, but in spirit. A bulletin board outside displayed a community pledge, signed by every member of the department, promising to uphold their duty with integrity and respect. Emma stopped to read it, her fingers lightly brushing over the signatures. "They're trying," Michael said softly, coming to stand beside her. Emma nodded, her chest tightening with a mix of emotions. "It's a start," she said. They stood there for a moment, the weight of the past heavy, but not overwhelming. For all the pain and humiliation they had endured, they had also witnessed the power of resilience and the capacity for change. At home that night, Emma sat on the couch with her laptop, scrolling through emails and messages from people who had been moved by their stories. One message in particular caught her attention. It was from Carla, the woman who had written to her months ago about her own experience with harassment. "Emma," the message read, "I just wanted to let you know that I finally reported the people who hurt me. For years I thought no one would believe me, but seeing you stand up for yourself gave me the courage to stand up for myself, too. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to fight for justice." Tears filled Emma's eyes as she read the words, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. She closed the laptop and leaned back against the couch, letting out a deep breath. Michael joined her moments later, handing her a cup of tea. "Busy day?" he asked, a small smile playing on his lips. Emma nodded, taking the cup and wrapping her hands around its warmth. "It's worth it," she said softly. "Every bit of it." Michael sat beside her, his arm draping around her shoulders. "We've come a long way," he said, "but there's still so much more to do." Emma rested her head against his shoulder, her gaze distant but hopeful. "Then we keep going," she said. "We keep fighting for Carla, for David, for everyone who's been through what we've been through. This is bigger than us. Michael kissed the top of her head, his voice filled with quiet conviction. And we'll see it through together. As the weeks turned into months, the momentum they had built continued to grow. The video of their assault became not just a piece of evidence, but a symbol, a reminder of what happens when people refuse to look the other way. Emma and Michael's names became synonymous with resilience and justice. But for them, it was never about recognition. It was about creating a world where no one else would have to endure what they had endured, where power was wielded responsibly, and where every voice mattered. One evening, as they walked through a park where children played and families gathered, Emma paused to watch the scene before her. Laughter filled the air, mingling with the golden light of the setting sun. "It's a beautiful thing," she said softly. Michael followed her gaze, his smile gentle. "What is?" "Hope," Emma replied. "It's everywhere now. You can feel it." Michael squeezed her hand, his eyes warm as he looked at her. "And it started with you." Emma shook her head, a quiet smile tugging at her lips. "It started with us," she said, "and it's not over yet." As they stood there, bathed in the glow of a city that was healing, they knew that their journey wasn't just about seeking justice. It was about building a legacy of change, one step at a time. Emma and Michael's journey wasn't just about confronting those who wronged them. It was a testament to the power of standing firm in the face of injustice. Their story reminds us that while cruelty and abuse of power can feel insurmountable at the moment, resilience and courage can turn even the darkest experiences into sparks for change. Through their unwavering determination, Emma and Michael not only sought justice for themselves, but ignited a movement that inspired countless others to speak up, demand accountability, and believe in the possibility of a fairer world. Their fight was not just a personal victory, but a collective triumph for everyone who has ever felt silenced or powerless. This story leaves us with an undeniable truth. Change is possible when we confront wrongdoing with strength and integrity. It shows us that our voices matter and that justice, though often hard-won, is worth every effort. If this story resonated with you, let us know how it made you feel. Comment 1 if you found it inspiring, or 2 if you thought it was deeply impactful. Have you ever faced a moment where you had to stand up against injustice? Share your story with us in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more stories that challenge, uplift, and remind us of the power of resilience. Join the conversation, share your thoughts, and stay tuned for more incredible narratives that shine a light on the human spirit. Together, let's keep the conversation going and make the world a little brighter, one story at a time.